Some of you may have heard that the Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real live ghost town. Disney built the Treasure Island resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't start as a ghost town. Disney's cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists to relax in luxury. This is a fact. Look it up. Disney blew $30 million on the place. Yeah, $30 million. Then they abandoned it. Disney blamed the shallow waters, too shallow for their ships to safely operate. It was even blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas, they were too lazy to work a regular schedule. That's where the factual nature of their story ends. It wasn't because of sand, and obviously was because foreigners are lazy. Again, both are convenience excuses. No, I sincerely doubt those reasons were legitimate. Why don't I buy the official story? Because of Mowgli's Palace. In the beachside city of Emerald in North Carolina, Disney began construction of Mowgli's Palace in the late 1990s. The concept was a jungle-themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the center of the whole thing. If you're unfamiliar with the character of Mowgli, then you might better remember the story, The Jungle Book. If you've seen it anywhere else, you know it as the Disney cartoon from decades past. Mowgli is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals and simultaneously threatened/pursued by other animals. Mowgli's Palace was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney bought up a ton of high-priced land for the project. There was actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, then turned around and sold the properties to Disney. At one point, a home that had just been constructed was immediately condemned with little to no explanation. The land grab by the government was exposed for some fictional highway project. Knowing full well what was going on, people started calling it Mickey Mouse Highway. Then there was the concept part. A group of stuffed shirts from Disney Co. actually held a city meeting. They intended to tell everyone how lucrative this project was going to be for everyone. When they showed the concept art, this gigantic palace, surrounded by jungle, stacked with men and women in loincloths and tribal gear, well, suffice to say, everyone flipped their shit. We're talking about a large Indian palace with jungle and loincloths, not only in the center of a relatively wealthy area, but a somewhat xenophobic area of the southern US. It was a questionable mix at that point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he was quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. Disney took that community and essentially broke it over his knee as well. The houses were razed, the land was cleared, and wasn't a damn thing anyone could say or do about it. Local TV and newspapers were against the resort from the beginning, but some insane connection between Disney's media holdings and their local venues came into play. Their opinions turned on a dime. So anyway, Treasure Island, Bahamas. Disney sunk those millions in and then split. Same thing happened with Mowgli's Palace. Construction was complete. Visitors actually stayed at the resort. The surrounding communities were flooded with the traffic and usual annoyances associated with an influx of lost and irate tourists. It all stopped. Disney shut it down. Nobody knew what the hell to think, but they're pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a group of folks who did not want this in the first place. I honestly didn't give the place enough thought since hearing it closed over a decade ago. I lived maybe 4 hours from Emerald, so I only heard the rumblings and didn't experience any of it firsthand. Then I read this article from someone who had explored the Treasure Island Resort. He posted a whole blog about all the crazy shit he found there. Stuff just left behind, things smashed, defaced, probably ruined by the disgruntled former employees of Two-Block who just lost their jobs. Hell, all the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking that place. People there just felt about as angry about his Treasure Island as folks here did feel about Mowgli's Palace. Plus, there were rumors that Disney had replaced their aquarium stock into the local waters when they closed, including sharks. You know, who wouldn't want to take a few swings at some merchandise after that? Well, what I'm getting at is that this blog about Treasure Island got me thinking. Even though it's been many years since it had passed since its closing, I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploration at Wilson's Palace. Take some photos, write about my experience, and see if there was something I could take home as a memento. I'm not gonna say I wasted no time in getting there, because honestly, it took me another year after I found that first Treasure Island article, to get around and going up to Omaha. Over the course of that year, I did a lot of research on the Palace Resort. Rather, I tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made any mention of that place. Kind of been scrubbed clean. Even odder, however, was that nobody before myself had apparently thought to blog about the place or even post a photo. The local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though that was to be expected since they all swung Disney's way. They wouldn't be out there alone in their embarrassment, you know? Recently, I learned that corporations can actually ask Google, for example, to remove links from search results, basically for no good reason. Looking back, it's probably not because that nobody spoke of the resort. It was that their words were rather made inaccessible. So in the end, I could barely find the place. I mean, all I had to go on was an old as hell map that I received back in the 90s. It was promotional items sent out to people who had recently been to Disney World. I guess since I'd been there in the late 80s, that was recent. I didn't really intend to hang on to it. It just got shoved into my books and comics from my childhood. I only remembered it months into my research, and then even then, it took me another few weeks to locate the storage bin that my parents had it all shoved into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, as most were transplants who had moved to the beach in recent years, and no residents just sneered at me or made rude gestures with the second I managed to say, "Where could I find Mowgli's?" The drive took me through an inordinately long corridor of overgrowth. Tropical plants that had run rampant in an overpopulated area, mixed with the native species of flora that actually belonged there, and I tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort. Tremendous monolithic wooden gates, whose supports to either side looked like they must have been cut from giant sequoias. The gate itself had been gouged in by several places by woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Hanging on the gate was a sheet of metal, some random scrap, with hand-painted letters scrawled in black, saying, "Abandoned by Disney." Clearly the handiwork of some past local or some employee who wanted to make some small protest. The gates were open enough to walk through, but not drive, so grabbing my digital camera on the map, whose flip side showed a layout of the resort, I set off on foot. The inner grounds of the palace were just as overgrown as the entryway. Palm trees stood unattended and ragged amongst the piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants similarly stood in their own stinking, bug-riddled refuse. There was this sort of clash between order and chaos as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers mixed with obnoxious tall weeds and sinking, blacking mushrooms. All that remained of any outdoor structures were broken, rotten wood, and various charred bits of unidentifiable material. What was most likely an information booth or an outdoor bar was now simply a pile of disordered debris chopped up past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting thing on the grounds was a statue of Baloo, the felon bear from Jungle Book, which stood in the courtyard in front of the main building. He was frozen in a joyful wave towards no one, staring into empty space with silly toothy grin, and his bird crap covered the whole swath of his fur and vines snared his platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only to find the outside of the building covered in graffiti where the original paint had been peeled or just chipped away. The front doors weren't just open, they had been taken off their hinges and were stolen. Above the front doors of the gaping maw where they once been, someone again had painted, "Abandoned by Disney." I wish I could tell you about all the awesome stuff I found inside the palace. Forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, a full-fledged secret society of homeless bums. But no. The inside of the building was so stark, so bare, that I actually think that people have stolen the molding off the walls. Anything that was too big to steal, counters, desks, fake trees, they were all resting in this empty echo chamber that amplified never slept, like a slow rat-a-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan and headed to all the locations that might seem in any way interesting. The kitchen was as you imagined, an industrial food prep area with all the appliances, no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled like very old piss. The huge freezer, not even remotely cool now, had row upon row of empty shelf space hung from the ceiling, probably cuts of meat, and as I stood inside for a moment, I noticed they were swinging. Each hook swung in a random direction, but their movements were so slow and small that it was almost impossible to see. I figured it had been caused by my footsteps, so I stopped one from swinging by clutching it in my fists, then carefully letting go. But within seconds, it started to swing once more. The rooms were in much the same state as the rest of the palace. Just like the Treasure Island Resort, someone had methodically smashed each porcelain commode with coconuts and other implements. There was a half an inch of rancid, stinking, stagnant water on the floor, so I didn't stay there very long. Ugh. What's odd is that the toilets and the sinks in the bibs in the ladies' room, yes, I went there, all dripped, leaked, or ran freely. It seemed to me that they should have shut the water off a long time ago. There are plenty of rooms in the resort, but naturally I didn't have time to look through them all. The few I did peer into were similarly wrecked, and I didn't expect to find anything in there. I thought there was actually a television or radio in one room as a quiet conversation coming out. Though it was like a whisper, probably. My own breathing echoing in the silence, or another case of the sound of flowing water playing tricks on me in the mind. This is what it sounded like. I didn't believe it. I know that. My father told you. I know, that sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced. Well, I thought there might have been someone running in that room, or worse, some vagrants who had holed up in there and probably would have knifed me. At the front doors of the palace again, I figured I hadn't found anything of note, and I wasted the trip up. As I looked out the door, I noticed something interesting in the courtyard that I apparently missed. Something that would give me at least one thing to show for my trouble, even if it were just a photograph. There was a lifelike statue of a python, maybe 8 feet long, coiled up and sunning itself on the pedestal right on the center of the area. It was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell upon the object in the perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo. I stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved close to get the detail of his face. Slowly, casually, the python lifted its head, looked directly into my eyes, turned, and slithered off from the pedestal, across the grass, and into the trees. All 80 feet of it. Its head long disappeared into the woods before its tail even left the sunny spot. Disney heavily sold their exotic animals onto the grounds. Right there on my floor plan map was the reptile house. Should have known. I read about the sharks at Treasure Isle. I should have known they'd done this. I was dumbfounded, just utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back to Earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed away from where the snake had been, back towards the palace. Even though I wasn't totally gone, I still wasn't taking any chances, and backed my way into the building. It only took a few deep breaths and slaps on my own face to get myself right in the head after that. And I looked for a place to sit down, as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at this point. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline in the broken glass and dead leaf carpet, or roll myself up onto a desk of questionable reliability. I had seen some stairs near the palace lobby and decided to go have a seat there until I felt better. The stairway was far enough from the front of the building to be relatively clean, save for a startling accumulation of dust. I once again pulled a wedge off the middle of the wall, and once again painted with the abandoned by Disney motto I'd become accustomed to. I placed the wedge down the stairs and sat on it to keep the least somewhat clean. The stairway led downward, below ground level, using my camouflage as a improvised flashlight. I could see that the staircase ended in a metal mesh door with a padlock. A sign on the door, a real sign, that said, "Mascots only. Thank you." This perked up my spirits a little bit, for two reasons. One, a mascots only area would definitely have some interesting stuff back in the day. Two, the padlock's still in place, so nobody had gone there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. This was the only place I could actually explore and perhaps find something of interesting to photograph or wantonly steal. I had come to the palace essentially agreeing with myself that it was okay to take anything I want, cause hey, abandoned, right? It didn't take much to bust the lock. Well, actually that's wrong. It didn't take much to bust the metal plate on the wall that the padlock was set to. Simon the Kid did most of the work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough just to pull the screws out of the wall, something nobody else had apparently thought of or had been able to do at the time. The mascots only area was a startling and welcome change from the rest of the building I've seen. For one, every second or third fluorescent light overhead was illuminated, even though it flickered and faded randomly. Also, nothing had been stolen or broken, even if age or exposure were definitely taking their toll. Tables had notepads, pens, there were clocks, even a punching clock on the wall, complete with filled-out timeout cards. The chairs were scattered around, and there was even a small break room with a static-filled television and long rotted-out food and drink on the counters. It was like one of those post-apocalyptic movies where everything is left in a state of evacuation. As I walked the maze-like sub-like basements, hallways of the mascots only area, the sights just became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over, paper scattered and almost melted with the damp floor, and a large carpet of wool was slowly overtaking the real, rotten, crimson floor cover. Everything was sort of just squishy. Anything with wood just ran into mush when I applied even the littlest amount of force. Clothing items hanging out in hooks, and the room simply fell to moist threads if I tried to run. One thing that annoyed me most was that the light was becoming more sparse and unreliable as I went further into the dank, suffocating depths of the palace. Eventually, I reached a black and yellow striped door with the words "Care to Prep 1" stenciled on it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured out this was a costume I had kept, and I definitely want a photograph of that twisted mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door wouldn't budge. Until I gave up and started to walk away. That's when there was a slight popping sound, and the door creaked open slowly. Inside the room is completely dark. Pitch black. I used the camouflage to look for a light switch by the wall. There was nothing. As I made my search, I was jarred out by my sense of excitement by a loud electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed of life, flickering and fading in and out like the rest I had passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed like the light was going to keep getting brighter and brighter until the bulbs exploded. But just when I thought it reached that critical stage, the lights dimmed a bit and steadied. The room was exactly as I pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung up on the walls, fully put together like strange cartoon cadavers hung from invisible nooses. There was an entire rack of loincloths and native clothes on the hangers towards the back. What I found odd and what I wanted to photograph right away was a Mickey Mouse costume at the center of the room. Unlike the other costumes, it was lying on its back at the center of the floor like a murder victim. The fur on the costume was rotten and shedding, creating bare patches. What was even odder was the coloring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of the actual Mickey Mouse. Black where it should be white, white where it should be black. His normally red overalls were light blue. The sight was off-putting enough that I actually put off photographing the thing until last. I took a picture of the costumes hanging on the walls, upward angles, downward angles, side shots to show an entire row of frozen, putrid cartoon faces, and some with plastic eyes missing. And I decided to stage a shot, just one of the bedraggled characters' heads on the slick, grimy floor. I reached for the headpiece of a Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing would fall apart. As I looked in the face of the wide-eyed, moldering hill, a loud clattering sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet. In between my shoes there was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at me. Feet. Only the empty face and lower jaw remained staring up at me. I dropped the duck head immediately and, as you expect, moved towards the door. And as I stood in the doorway, I looked back at the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture of it, you know? I had to. For a number of reasons that may seem silly, but only if you don't think it through. I need proof of what happened. Especially if Disney was going to make this somehow go away. I had no doubt in my mind right from the start that even if it was just gross negligence, Disney was responsible. That's when Mickey, photo negative, opposite Mickey in the middle of the floor, started to go.
First sitting up, then climbing to its feet. The Mickey Mouse costume, or whoever was inside of it, stood there at the center of the room, its fake face just staring directly at me as I mumbled. Over and over and over. With shaking hands, a violent thrashing heart, and legs that had once again turned to jelly, I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposite creature, now quietly sizing me up. The digital camera screen displayed all the dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, mounting the screen wherever Mickey's outline moved to. The camera died. The blank, quiet, broken. I once again raised my eyes to the Mickey Mouse costume.
Hey! Wanna see my head? Come on!
It said, in a hushed, perverted, but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice. It started to pull at his own head, working its clumsy, glove-like fingers around its neck, with prolonged, impatient movements similar to a wounded man trying to free himself of a predator's jaws. As it works its edges into his neck, so much blood, so much thick, chunky, yellow blood. As I turned away, as I heard a sickening tearing of full cloth and flesh, I only cared about getting away. Above the doorway out of this room, I saw the final message, and in the metal, clawed in the middle with bone, fingernails. Abandoned by God. I never got the pictures out of the camera. I never wrote a blog entry about it. After I ran from that place, fled for my sanity, if not for my very life. I knew why Disney didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in. They didn't want